1980. Queridas mujeres de color, compañeras de la escritura, aquí, al sol, estoy sentada encuerada, máquina de escribir contra las rodillas, tratando de representármelas en mi mente. Una negra arrebujada sobre un escritorio en el 5º piso de alguna casa de vecindad en Nueva York. Una chicana sentada en un porche en el sur de Texas, abanicándose contra los zancudos y el aire cálido, tratando de estimular las chispas ardientes de la escritura. Una mujer indígena andando a la escuela o al trabajo, lamentando la falta de tiempo para tejer la escritura en su vida. Una madre soltera, lésbica, asiático-americana, jalada en todas direcciones por sus hijos, amante o exmarido y la escritura. No es fácil escribir esta carta. Empezó como poema, un poema largo. Traté de convertirlo en un ensayo, pero resultó rígido, frío. Aún no he desaprendido el lavado de cerebro, la mierda esotérica y el pseudointelectualismo que la escuela ha forzado en mi escritura. ¿Cómo empezar de nuevo? ¿Cómo aproximar la intimidad y la inmediación que quiero? ¿Cuál forma? Una carta, por supuesto. Mis queridas hermanas, hay muchos peligros que confrontamos como mujeres de color. No podemos trascender los peligros ni ascender sobre ellos. Tenemos que atravesarlos y esperar que no tengamos que repetir la acción. No es probable ser amigas de gente literaria en lugares altos. La principiante de color es invisible en el mundo principal del hombre blanco y en el mundo feminista de las mujeres blancas, aunque en este hay cambios graduales. La lesbiana de color no solo es invisible, ni siquiera existe. Nuestro lenguaje también es inaudible. Hablamos en lenguas como las repudiadas y locas, porque ojos de blancos no quieren conocernos, no se molestan por aprender nuestro lenguaje, el lenguaje que nos refleja a nosotras, a nuestra cultura, a nuestro espíritu. Las escuelas a que asistimos o no asistimos no nos dieron las habilidades para escribir, ni la confianza en que teníamos de usar los idiomas de nuestra clase y etnicidad. Yo, por una, me especialicé y me hice adepta en el inglés por despecho para desmentir a los arrogantes maestros racistas que pensaban que todos los niños chicanos eran tontos y sucios. Y no se nos enseñó español en primaria, y no se nos exigió en la secundaria. Y aunque ahora escribo mis poemas en español, tanto como en inglés, siento el robo de mi lengua nativa. Me falta la imaginación, dices. No, me falta el lenguaje para clarificar, mi resistencia a las letradas. Las palabras son una guerra para mí, amenazan a mi familia. Para ganar la palabra, para describir la pérdida, tomo el riesgo de perder todo. Podré crear un monstruo, el cuerpo y extensión de la palabra, hinchándose de colores y emocionante amenazando a mi madre caracterizada. Su voz en la distancia, analfabeta, ininteligible. Estas son las palabras del monstruo, poema de Sherry Moraga. ¿Quién nos dio el permiso de realizar el acto de escribir? ¿Por qué será que el escribir se siente tan innatural para mí? Hago cualquier cosa para posponerlo, vaciar la basura, contestar el teléfono, la voz vuelve a recurrir en mí. ¿Quién soy yo, una pobre chicanita del campo que piensa que puede escribir? ¿Cómo aún me atrevo a considerar hacerme escritora mientras me agachaba sobre las siembras de tomates, encorvada bajo el sol caliente, manos ensanchadas y callosas, no apropiadas para sostener la pluma, embrutecida como animal estupefacto por el calor? Qué difícil es para nosotras pensar que podemos ser escritoras y más aún sentir y creer que podemos hacerlo. ¿Qué tenemos para contribuir, para dar? Nuestras propias.
Bom, essa leitura da carta da Gloria Anzaldua continua, vocês podem acessar no nosso site. Enfim, ela é um pouquinho longa, então por isso nós trouxemos apenas um trechinho antes para homenageá-la e dar início à mesa. Fique à vontade, Susana, Miriam.
Bom, me foi dada a demanda de apresentar a Paula, e eu, primeiro, queria dizer que é com muita alegria que eu agradeço o convite da Susana, Carol, Mérida, todas as outras organizadoras dessas jornadas, para apresentar a nossa querida colega Paola Bacchetta. A Paula, ela é professora do Departamento de Estudos de Gênero da Universidade de Berkeley, na Califórnia, Estados Unidos, e atua em vários centros de pesquisa dessa universidade. No Beatrice Bain Research Group, que é um dos históricos centros de estudos feministas norte-americanos, na equipe de pesquisa sobre gênero e raça, no pioneiro centro de estudos sobre as direitas do mundo e uma série de outras atividades que o tempo inteiro Paula está sendo convidada a integrar comissões e grupos para resolver uma série de outras questões. Ela tem tido um papel político muito importante na Universidade de Berkeley. A Paula, ela fez parte de um dos grupos lésbicos pioneiros norte-americanos, o Dyke Tyke, e ela esteve exilada nos anos 80, 90, devido ao seu engajamento com grupos de resistência racial nos Estados Unidos. Ela esteve exilada na França. Durante essa estadia na França, ela ajudou também e participou de um dos primeiros grupos lésbicos de cor, composto por mulheres lésbicas não brancas, residentes em Paris naquele momento. Engajada também naquele momento dos anos 80, 90, no movimento feminista global, ela participou várias conferências globais, e ela viveu na Índia por vários anos. E foi lá na Índia que ela realizou a pesquisa do seu doutorado em sociologia, defendida na França, sobre um grupo de extrema-direita, no norte da Índia, hoje um tema da maior importância e da maior atualidade depois da eleição do atual presidente indiano, que, aliás, é muito próximo do presidente Bolsonaro, como nós sabemos. Foi também na Índia que a Paula frequentou o grupo inicial dos estudos subalternos. E ela fez, então, nesse momento dos anos 90, 80, 90, ela fez circular essas questões das teorias subalternas entre a Índia, a França e nos Estados Unidos, quando ela voltou nos anos 90. Na Califórnia, em Berkeley, a Paula se aproximou dos estudos chicanos e se tornou uma das principais tradutoras culturais da obra da Anzaldua na França, que é o tema que ela vai abordar também hoje na sua conferência. Já faz mais de uma década que a Paula tem circulado por outros lugares do mundo, também pelo Brasil, compartilhando seus conhecimentos sobre movimentos sociais globais, a coprodução das teorias políticas e as questões decoloniais que articulam já vários continentes em eventos aqui no Brasil, como Fazendo Gênero, a Unpox, o Desfazendo Gênero e uma série de outros eventos. É por tudo isso que nós temos muito prazer de acolher e de escutar a Paula hoje nos falar sobre a obra de Gloria Anzaldua, que ela conhece tão bem, por ser uma pessoa que participa ativamente dos círculos de tradução da Gloria Anzaldua e da tradução, não só da tradução linguística, mas da tradução cultural desse trabalho, como foi o caso, há 2 anos atrás, de um grande evento que aconteceu em Paris, reunindo pesquisadores do mundo inteiro que trabalham sobre Gloria Anzaldua. Seja bem-vinda, Paula, queremos te escutar. Paola, je t'ai présenté.
Ok.
Et maintenant, tu peux, je vais parler un peu de trajectoire. Et là, tu peux commencer ta conférence.
Ok. Merci beaucoup, Miriam. Merci beaucoup. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference, Susana de Castro and Carol Marin, and I thank Miriam Grossi for the invitation to speak today. I thank Miriam and Susana de Castro for their attention to my talk as discussants, and it's an honor to speak here with you both and with all the colleagues and folks who are listening. I thank Carmen Real and Susana de Castro and Felipe Fernandez for translating this text into Portuguese. I'm sorry I can't deliver the talk in Portuguese, but my peoples were colonized by the English, not the Portuguese, and I'm only now learning Portuguese. I thank Miriam Grossi for translating in French and Portuguese the discussion following the talk. So I'll speak about Gloria Evangelina Anzaldua and her circulations in Turtle Island, or that part of the earth that colonizers call the United States or the US, and in France. But as none of us are neutral subjects, and as our understandings and interpretations are always already located somewhere, before I begin, I would like to briefly situate myself so that you know a bit about who's speaking and my relation to this topic. In doing so...
Excuse me, est-ce que tu peux parler un peu plus lentement
Oui,
pour que les gens puissent t'accompagner?
Okay, je peux.
Can you talk a little bit more louder or from the microphone, perhaps? Yes. I don't know if you can talk.
My microphone is actually not. Is this better? Is this better?
Much better. Much better. But then we cannot see you. It's not good.
You can't? Can you see me? Okay. So can you see me now? Okay, perfect.
Now it's better.
Okay, thank you for those adjustments. And I'll continue. I was talking about how I would situate myself, that the importance of, not imagining that we are neutral subjects. And to do so, I aim to respect an exigency configured by feminists of color in Turtle Island, including Gloria Anzaldua herself, in an essay entitled On Writing Borderlands La Frontera, that is published in 2009, Anzaldua notes, "One thing I urge you to do when you are reading and writing is to figure out literally where your feet stand, what position you are taking. Are you speaking from a white male middle class perspective? Are you speaking from a working class, colored, ethnic location? For whom are you speaking? To whom are you speaking? What is the context? Where do you locate your experience?" This position taken to situate oneself is simultaneously in coherency with an insight by the French anthropologist Jean Favre-Sada, who in 1977 wrote, "The conditions of objectivity are subjectivity." With this in mind, to proceed, I want to mention I was born on the territory of the Lenape people in a place that colonizers call New York. And I speak to you now from my desk in Huichin, home of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people.
Recording in progress.
In a place that colonizers call Berkeley. It's important to highlight that the US imposed itself upon Turtle Island with the genocide of 100 million native people. It developed by slavery, including the murder of 5 million enslaved people, the capitalist exploitation of workers, the differential colonial racist kinds of misogynarchic exploitation of all women's reproductive and productive labor. In this context, I was born into a mixed family, an effect of genocide, poverty, war, migration. My heritage is Wayuu, Venezuelan side, Turkish, Italian, and Northeast African. My family is a large extended family. In it are people ranging from working class to middle class. I grew up as a lesbian of color, having never gone through a heterosexual phase. Due to my political activities as a young person, I ended up in exile, first in Rome for 2 years, then in Paris. I lived in both places as undocumented for 7 years. I then lived in India for 6 years. Following that, I have lived about half of the rest of my life in France and half in Turtle Island. Notwithstanding my various racialized and situational subalternities, I want to equally mention my personal acquired class privilege, including cultural capital as a professor at a top university in the colonial imperial United States. I am thus located in hybrid ways in relation to empire. In my discussion of Anzaldua here, I will be operationalizing the interrelated notions of thick historiography and thick historical contextuality. Long ago, I proposed thick historiography to consider a rewriting of history that broadens the scope of what counts as a historical subject, archival item, object, or event, and that invites multiple strands of telling, including contradictory ones. I was inspired to think about thick historiography by Gilbert Pyle and Clifford Geertz's notion of thick description. For both, thick is to highlight the meanings of an action, item, conduct inside a contextual episteme and not solely the anthropologist. Thick points to the coexistence of multiplicities of meaning and interpretation. I mean thick historiography to open up our archives and analytics to create historiographies that do not reproduce, create, or fix a thin, unique narrative of truth that can become a dominant discourse, thus available to be wielded against subalterns. Instead, thick is a way to displace truth, to affirm many simultaneous contextual truths, to leave historical narratives open to futurities of archival items, fields of intelligibility, and sense-making that they may not have imagined. In relation to thick historiography, thick historical contextuality preserves the idea of thick and the archival and interpretive work that it accomplishes. In addition, it highlights the importance of thick contextuality for the ingredients to any narrative. These include kinds of archival materials that may not necessarily be imagined as valid archival materials, such as gossip, hallucinations, trance states, the episteme of reception with its presuppositions, categories of thought, logics, conclusions, the specific fields of intelligibility within the episteme, through which we try to create an interpretation of any subject, object, or event that is ever unfinished, unstable, open to yet other situated subalternities. In our case here, thick historical contextuality becomes a way of understanding the complexities of Gloria Anzaldua through the temporal spatialities of her life with her writing, artwork, spiritual practices, relationalities. It includes her distinct kinds of reception in different locations, and here, of course, Turtle Island and France. In what follows, I will introduce Gloria Anzaldua and her work. I will then, in keeping with thick historiography and thick historical contextuality, speak about what Anzaldua and her work have meant in several contexts within Turtle Island. I will then discuss her translation and circulation in France before arriving at some concluding remarks. For those who may not yet be familiar with Gloria Anzaldua, I will briefly introduce her. She is a Chicanx writer, scholar, and artist. She was born on September 26, 1942, in the Rio Grande River Valley at the border of Texas and Mexico. She died of complications to diabetes on May 15, 2004 in Santa Cruz, California, a few miles from where I'm speaking now. Her body was then brought for burial to Hargel, Texas, also in the valley where she had lived throughout her childhood. A ceremony is regularly held at her gravesite by Chicana feminists. Anzaldua was the oldest of 4 children. Her family was of mixed classes across generations while she was growing up. Her mother's side included a judge in the local courts, yet during her adolescence, she worked in the fields alongside her parents and other farm workers. While her family had been in the United States for 14 generations in the dominant colonial racist field of intelligibility, she is still imagined as an immigrant, a perpetual foreigner, as are all who are not of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or by extension of another European heritage. Ironically, Anzaldua as mestiza, as part native, has roots deeper in this continent than any white person. Anzaldua graduated as valedictorian of Edinburgh High School in Hargo in 1962. After high school, she earned a BA in English, Art, and Secondary Education from University of Texas Pan American, and an MA in English and Education from University of Texas at Austin. While in Austin, she joined politically active cultural poets and radical dramatists such as Ricardo Sanchez, Hedwig Gorski. Later, as an older student, she was finishing a PhD at University of California, Santa Cruz when she died. Though her work was being taught at universities across the US for decades, she was only awarded her PhD after death. Anzaldua is mainly renowned for her first sole-authored book, Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza, in 1987, published with Antlut Press. It has been translated into many languages. It also is the object of numerous studies, including most recently a brilliant critical edition being published with Antlut Press. She is also known as the co-editor with Sheri Moraga of This Bridge Called My Back, a first collection of essays and poetry by US women of color. She additionally co-edited Making Face, Making Soul, Haciendo Caras, Creative and Critical Perspectives by Women of Color in 1990, and This Bridge We Call Home, Radical Visions for Transformation in 2002. She was finishing a book, Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro, Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, Reality, but passed away before it could be completed. It was published posthumously in 2015. She is the author of numerous important essays. She also published 3 children's books. Prietita Has a Friend in 1991, Friends from the Other Side, Amigos del Otro Lado in 1995, Prietita y la Llorona in 1996. She published sketches, drawings, and art in ink and crayons. Anzaldua is the recipient of many awards for her writing, which I will not name. Her artwork has been shown in solo exhibitions in San Antonio, Texas, at the University of Paris 8 in France. She has a place in many professional academic organizations. One of these, dedicated solely to her work, the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua, founded in 2007, holds a 3-day-long conference every year and a half with multiple simultaneous panels about her. Around her, a transnational community of scholars, artists, and activists has formed. Her work is now translated into many languages. Anzaldua's personal papers are deposited at the Gloria Evangelina Anzaldua Papers in the Benson Latin American Collection at Benson Library at University of Texas, Austin. According to Anzaldua archivist Itza A. Cabajal, the library did not want Anzaldua's papers until the formation of the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua and its regular conferences. Significantly, her papers are not located in the university's LGBTQ archives, but instead in its Latin American collection. Thus, Anzaldua's papers could not be contained or reduced to queer. Instead, they now live in a geopolitical space designated as Latin America, even if for Anzaldua herself, it was not Latin America, but rather Abya. Carvajal told me that the Benson Library was hardly frequented at all until Anzaldua's papers were added. Now, it is the most visited of all the libraries on campus. Here we can observe how the inclusion of such a marginal subaltern subject to an archive constituted in relations of power in the Derridian sense cannot be reduced to the merely additive. Instead, the unaltered represence of Anzaldua's archive on its own terms, an archive that clearly defies white Latinx heteronormative respectability, has already done transformative work in the Benson Library. In fact, Anzaldua herself was an archivist. Her papers there consist of what she collected and the categories according to which she herself organized them. In sum, the addition of Anzaldua's self-produced and self-contextualized archive reconstitutes the entire library in multiple ways. Anzaldua left to us books, essays, poetry, journal entries, scribbles, drawings, paintings, photos. They speak to the many dimensions of her identities at once. They are written in many languages. Her work is so rich conceptually and methodologically that it has generated enormous engagement. I will now discuss some of Anzaldua's major conceptual and methodological contributions to several fields. The first is women's gender and sexuality studies. Among her very striking contributions, and there are so many of them, is her foundational theorization regarding queer theory and queer of color theory. Today, queer theory is primarily associated with non-intersectional and non-decolonial queer scholarship in the US and internationally. However, to think queer theory with thick historical contextuality is to become aware of multiple genealogies of queer. Notably, we would immediately perceive that the indigenous queers, queers of color in the global north, and queers in the global south have long produced queer analytics of gender and sexuality that inseparably engage with colonialism, capitalism, racism, misogynarchies. In the US, what I will call the dominant white-centric thin historiography that dominates in the academy, that is reinforced through repetitions, including transnationally, proceeds in the Derridian sense through erasures and destruction. However, Anzaldua is actually the first academic to bring the word and concept of queer into the academy, into the university, in 1987 with Borderlands La Frontera. Actually, it was in 1979 with Prietita, but I will get back to that. However, in Borderlands, Anzaldua suggests that queer not as an identity, but rather as a caughtness in relations of power, in coloniality, racism, misogyny, as a set of dispositions, as a sensible and relational orientation, as a corporal embodiment. Anzaldua's co-edited anthology with Shiri Moraga, This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Women of Color, is another pathbreaker, and it lay a foundation in the academy for areas of scholarship called Women of Color Theory, Queer of Color Theory, and Trans of Color Theory. That book is the topic of much later writing, perhaps most significant of which is Norma Alarcon's now classic article, the theoretical subjects of this bridge. In it, Alarcón points out that this bridge and subsequent feminist of color texts in white-dominated gender, sexuality, and women's studies in the US, reduced to spicy, entertaining narratives, the narratives of women of color, and did not recognize their theoretical contributions. So Anzaldua posed a whole series of concept terms that now inform scholarship in the field. An example is the concept of el mundo surdo, or the left-hand word with S instead of the Castilian Z, which respects the way zurdo is pronounced in southern Texas. She later used el mundo zurdo with Z instead. By this concept, she meant to signal forms of collectivity among differently situated subjects and communities, all working towards a vision for revolutionary change. Anzaldua named the reading group and series of writing workshops that she conducted El Mundo Surdo. Later, the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua, which I mentioned earlier, called its regular conferences El Mundo Surdo. In ethnic studies and in Latinx and Chicanx studies, some of Anzaldua's most striking work was to interrogate the dominant thin historiographies of the region, that is, the Anglo-American and white-centric Mexican historiographies. She offered instead a different history that is situated in the lives and conditions of indigenous, mestiza, and queer subjects. To do so, she suggested the notion of autohistoria teoria, or a fusion of personal, autobiographical, and collective historical writing that keeps questions of justice in the forefront. Autohistoria teoria thus makes an archival intervention by working with a different set of items and a historical, interpretive, epistemic intervention by grounding its historiography in contextual, subaltern presuppositions, concepts, logics, and conclusions. Another Anzalduan concept is mestiza consciousness, or consciousness of inhabiting multiple worlds because of how one is simultaneously, multiply situated in relation to indigeneity, ethnicity, cultures, languages, gender, sexualities. It is itself a recognition of the thickness of historical contextuality. This consciousness provides the impetus for the construction of what she calls the new mestiza. Anzaldua's work has been central to many strands of the heterogeneous transnational array of scholarship that is often placed under the rubric of decolonial theory. She is cited by those who in the US Academy are imagined as founders of decolonial theory, such as Walter Mignolo. Her notion of borderlands with small b and borderlands large b is capital B, is often mobilized in decolonial theory. For Anzaldua, borderlands small b signifies the area where Texas and Mexico meet, thus the imposed colonial physical border. She likens that space to a wound that bleeds. In contrast, borderlands, capital B, includes the physical geographical space of the borderlands, small b, but it additionally signals multiple simultaneous other divisions and dimensions: epistemic, psychic, spiritual, sexual. In the realm of decolonial feminist and queer theory, Anzaldua's contribution has been equally immense. For instance, many younger scholars at this time are mobilizing her approach to ways of knowing that have been denigrated in the academy: indigenous knowledge, dreamscapes, transcapes, hallucinations, the wisdom of ancestors, ghosts, and apparitions. Some examples that I find particularly compelling are the work in trans studies of color and meditations particularly by P.J. Di Pietro and Omi Salas Santos. Now, about Anzaldua's work in France, the first complete translation of a text by Anzaldua was published in 2011 in a special issue of the feminist academic journal Les Cahiers du CEDREF, the CEDREF notebooks. This was a special issue on decolonial feminist and queer theory, Chicana and US Latina interventions, co-edited by Norma Alarcón, Jules Falquet, and myself. Jules and I did the first translation together. We chose chapter 7 from Borderlands, entitled La conciencia de la mestiza towards a new consciousness. The translation posed a number of challenges. One was what to do about Anzaldua's use of multiple languages. They are all deeply inserted into and continually co-constituted anew with specific relations of power, including epistemic violence, but also with intimacies, connections, relationalities. In her preface to the first edition, Anzaldua states, and this is the first edition of Borderlands La Frontera, the switching of codes in this book from English to Castilian, Spanish, to the Northern Mexican dialect, to Tex-Mex, to a sprinkling of Nahuatl, to a mixture of all of these, reflects my language, a new language, the language of the borderlands, capital B. Later, in the chapter entitled How to Tame a Wild Tongue, Anzaldua reminds us that lurking within most of these rubrics of languages are ever more languages. She numbers and names them thus: 1, Standard English; 2, Working Class and Slang English; 3, Standard Spanish; 4, Standard Mexican Spanish; 5, North Mexican Spanish dialect; 6, Chicano Spanish. From Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, we have regional variations. 7, Tex-Mex; 8, Pachuco, also called Calo. In a next sentence, she tells us that her home languages are from the last 5 listed, with 6 and 7 being close to my heart. In our translation, we respected Anzaldua's linguistic hybridity, her prioritization, and her wish to leave terms in some languages untranslated and without notes. We thus only translated into French what Anzaldua had written in English. In both the English and French version, this Anzalduan choice reminds the reader that to understand another object, here Anzaldua, to form a relationship with her, as Gayatri Spivak argues about the process of translation itself, it is an effort, work, a learning process, a loving enactment. Second, as Walter Benjamin points out in his classic article, The Task of the Translator, from 1923, translations generally pose questions about the text or about the translator's poetic freedom, about fidelity to the text or the translator's poetic freedom to express the text. For Benjamin, too much fidelity and too much license make for bad translation. Instead, the language of the translation must give voice to the intention of the original. He suggests that the task of the translator is to release in her own language, that pure language which is under the spell of another, to liberate the language imprisoned in a work, in her recreation of that work. The afterlife of the original is, for Benjamin, about the original's flowering and its transformation in both the original language and the second language. In this dilemma, we work to respect Anzaldua's intended meanings, but also to provide the flavor of her literary wanderings. A third problem concerned Anzaldua's subalternly positioned use of English, which for us, Anzaldua and myself, remains a colonial language, even if it is the language, or rather languages in the plural, that we speak most fluently. In the original borderlands, La Frontera, two different class-situated forms of Englishes take up the most space, yet their authority is simultaneously, joyfully undermined in many ways that were important for us, Jules and myself, as translators, to clarify. To translate the Englishes into Frenches, of course, meant, in the most basic of political dimensions, transposing Anzaldua's words from one alien colonial language into another. However, more complexly, it also meant respecting how Anzaldua appropriated the coloniality in which we are saturated, how she made her way through it, made it her own, transformed it until it became something else entirely. Anzaldua subverts the Englishes, and not only by letting live their pluralization in standard and working class Englishes, she also decolonizes it, them, as they pass through her brown prieta vocal cords, throat and mouth, hands, entire body. Her words are situated without pretension to neutrality. Our task was to bring all dimensions of Anzaldua's words into Englishes, the subverting and creative presence of otherness within them into Frenches. To do so, we needed to respect the two geopolitical and linguistic contexts and the two very different kinds of borderlands, capital B and small b, they entail. We needed to be there with our whole bodies. This was not just a simple linguistic transposition. It was a relationality and of love and respect with Anzaldua. To work with it, I had to draw upon my own differential, subalternly racialized hybridity and sensibility. Gloria's words had entered my prieta body long ago and had caused quite a stir in there. They entered my heart, intestines, backbone, lungs, throat at once. I no longer knew what to think. I looked at the text in Englishes and spoke in Frenches. Jules wrote down whatever came out of my mouth. I gauged it by how it felt. Most of the time it felt accurate, but sometimes it felt just plain wrong. We needed monolingual and bilingual dictionaries, thesauruses, encyclopedias, but these tools were limited and we needed help beyond them. We found solidarity in collectivity. There were times when I waited up all night in Paris to call Norma Alarcón in San Antonio at a decent hour, only to blurt out in a state of panic, "Norma, we just cannot figure out how to translate this or that." Norma, an excellent pedagogue, patiently explained phrases, words that had caused me the deepest agony imaginable. To translate lovingly is beautiful, but it can sometimes end up as torture. One is so deeply worried, enters such a state of anxiety about the possibility of inadvertently performing any kind of epistemic violence to the text. How could we know exactly how to fully respect Gloria's words as we brought them into access to French's speaking folk? The translation brought me great joy most of the time, but sometimes it also brought me to tears. Another concern was how to ensure that Anzaldua's multi-semic borderlands, capital B, small b, remained close to the contextual meaning, one with the spirit of Anzaldua's words, even as they were carried from one geopolitical temporal spatiality to another. This brought us to another decision, not to try to make the translation conform to French realities. Instead, we would introduce the readers to a totally new reality, Gloria Anzaldua's. As in Englishes, there are class-situated variants of the French language too. For example, there is a French language created by working class racialized subjects. It's called verlan. But to use verlan would have meant losing the contextuality of Anzaldua's borderlands, capital B and small b. It would have forced Anzaldua to become French. Such an assimilationist move would constitute yet another colonization. It would do epistemic violence to Anzaldua's words and life. It would leave Anzaldua vulnerable to abusive singular pluralization. This is what French colonialism desires for all racialized others across very different kinds of borderlands, capital B, small b. The convenient reduction of our difference to a racialized other same. And sometimes colonialism and colonial racism are located and arrive at you from where you might not expect it. To point to some essential elements from a thick historical contextualization, I will mention that in France, we have many experiences of the stunning, overwhelming power of the violence of dominant distortion. For example, some years ago in Paris, a group of white French radical lesbians translated a text by Bell Hooks. Sounds great thus far, right? Well, they left out all references to racism and in their place substituted references to heterosexism. With Sirma Bilguet's 2015 essay entitled The Whitening of Intersectionality in Europe in mind, with that essay in mind, we can think of this gesture as the whitening of bell hooks. Similarly, to parallelize Anzaldua with one or another of the several racialized communities in France would mean disappearing Anzaldua. This, of course, we flatly refused to enact. Our concern instead was to keep Anzaldua intact. France would just have to deal with her. Relatedly, we were faced with a question of the broader contextuality of Frenches. We needed to make Anzaldua's work intelligible, not only to French-speaking people in France, but also to people across the French-speaking post-colonial world. These spaces are far from the US, Mexican, and borderlands, capital B and small b context. We were conscious that we were not addressing a tabula rasa. The overwhelming majority of feminist and queer texts from the US that have historically been translated into French are from white feminist and white queer theory. I define white feminist and white queer theory not in essentialist identitary terms, that is, not as reducible to theory produced by white subjects, but instead in political terms as theory that performs performs race and colonialism amnesia. As Norma Alarcón insightfully points out in the theoretical subjects of this bridge, white feminist and white queer theory reproduces the universalization of white subjects while erasing racism and subjects of color. These considerations kept us very attentive to the implications of each word that we put to the page. At the poetic end of things, we also needed to be mindful that the potential readership for the French's translation of Anzaldua's work always already imagined Anzaldua's home spaces and life experiences in limited, deformed ways. For example, Texas appears in France primarily through the TV show Dallas, about the mundane lives of absolutely boring, wealthy white people. Another site for Texas's apparition is in Westerns, those colonial fantasy productions with pretensions to historicity, in which either white cowboys conquered native people constructed as savages, or in which native people who are imagined through what Patrick Wolf calls, and I quote, genocidal logic, as always already vanished, gone. This serves as a backdrop to white cisgender male heroics. The latter is now extended with films such as Brokeback Mountain to white cisgender homo heroics. In some, the uneven flows in mediascapes, the dissemination of dominant filmic productions have meant that the French-speaking and reading public kind of knows, and I put that in quotes, in the US, in its various localities, quasi-exclusively through colonial and capitalist fantasies. Given this situation, we decided to translate Anzaldua in a way that pulls the reader out of her, their, his world and introduces her, them, him to Anzaldua's world. We decided to ask readers to draw their own lines of relationality, intimacy, friendship, love with Anzaldua's text. We put our faith in Anzaldua's insight and even her wish that, and I quote from her, the text will be different with each reader and reading, unquote. We have seen that happen in a multitude of ways. Finally, there is the question not only of words, but especially of the silences of the text. How to communicate this to the reader, how to keep present in the translation what Geiger Spivak calls the space outside language. For me, this is a question of translating with a thick historical contextualization in mind. It should allow the reader to go into those silent spaces. It is also about representing Anzaldua's state of mind, spirit, and corporeality, such as the feeling of blood flow, sweat on skin, the smell of home cooked food, the connection with all beings, the safe space she fled to inside herself, her trance states, her hallucinations, her loves. In the end, Anzaldua's work in translation created quite a stir in France. Her writing moved scholars, archivists, and activists. It inspired a transnational conference held at 3 universities in Paris in 2019. It was the focus of several art exhibits. It has been discussed in queer of color activist groups. Finally, at this time, the entire Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza, is being translated into French for publication at Calambakis, a small press that has published many US feminist of color translations. I am honored to oversee the translation and to write the preface. To conclude, I would like to make 3 brief remarks about how Anzaldua's work circulates in the US and France. In the US, Anzaldua's writings and other expressions continue to spread despite fascist and right-wing attempts to exclude from school and university curricula everything imagined under the rubric of critical race theory, but also gender theory, decolonial theory. Unfortunately, Texas, where Anzaldua was born and about which she writes, has taken the initiative to ban some books. The French context is equally hostile, if not more so. In France, there is not a single lesbian of color teaching a single course on lesbians of color anywhere in the academy. Several years ago, an academic conference on intersectionality, where I was to be a keynote speaker, was shut down by the French government, and only after much protest was the ban lifted. A few years ago, a number of French intellectuals published a collective letter to denounce decolonial theory. In February 2021, French higher education, research, and innovation minister Frédérique Vidal claimed that what she calls Islamo-gauchisme or Islamo-leftism is having a, quote, gangrene, unquote, effect on France. And she called for an inquiry into France's National Center for Scientific Research and the university. This, of course, is meant to purge the most respected research milieu and the university of critiques of colonialism, racism, and Islamophobia. Notwithstanding state and other blockage attempts, in both the US and in France, Anzaldua's work continues to circulate primarily among subaltern subjects, mainly feminist, queer, and trans of color subjects, largely under the radar of power. It remains in the US and in France an underside of still unacknowledged thick historiography that only thick historical contextualization on both sides of the Atlantic can hope to reveal. Thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Paola. Wonderful paper. And should I start commenting? What do you think, Miriam or Mary or Carol? It's up to you. I just want to thank you and say your work with this two concepts, thick and thin historiography and contextuality. It's a very useful tool. Thank you very much for presenting it. And it's amazing how this thin historiography are making such damage in our researches, so that the work of Anzaldua is just left out of the etiology, the genealogy of queer theory. It's an injustice, as you said in the contributions from Anzaldua. One of many of them is the fact that she was the first to talk about queerness in the sense of sexual orientation or anything like that. I mean, she was the first, but why is she not mentioned? Because of this white-centeredness, that is this thing is historiography that you mentioned, and it's wonderful how you work with this concept. I mean, I just wanted to read a little bit, a small quote from Anzaldua in Anzaldua's Anzaldua Reader. She says that she intended Borderlands not only to spread, but also to produce knowledge. The whole time I've been in school, the producers of knowledge have been middle and upper class white people, those with power in the universities, science establishments, and publishing and art houses. They produce the theories and books that we read. they produce the unconscious values, views, and assumptions about reality, about culture, about everything. We internalize, we assimilate these theories. And I think that's the big point of our whole journey. And I think it's a book made of her blood. She invites us to do also this, to put our life in our writings and to produce knowledge which will challenge this thin historiography and thin contextuality, which just erase our presence, erase our presence as people of color or as people from the periphery. No? It's just a wonderful paper. I thank you very much. If you would like to comment, I would like to hear you more about, especially El Mundo Sordo. It's a nice concept, and I would like to hear you more about how this revolutionary pedagogic from Anzaldua worked. And also, you mentioned it's very wonderful to hear how her work produced new approaches to knowledge nowadays, such as the GP Pietro work on hallucinations and meditations. It's wonderful how we can use other tools, other knowledge, and bring it inside university, bring inside our fields. So thank you very much. It was a nice, really nice paper.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments. I really appreciate the way that you engage with Anzaldua, and the points that you raise are extremely important. So the first thing about when you read the piece from the Anzaldua reader, the idea that Anzaldua wanted us to spread just Borderland should spread, but also produce knowledge. I think that's an important point, and I believe that she has produced knowledge. In fact, even in my own, she has inspired so many of my concepts, not just thin and thick historiography or thick historical contextuality, but many other. And an example relates to one of the things that you also mentioned. So, for example, I think with Anzaldua's notions of hallucinatory knowledge and knowledge by other means beyond the rational that is valued exclusively within the academy. And I have a notion of subalternative perception and intelligibility. Subalternative sensing, perception, and intelligibility, which is a category that is very much inspired by Anzaldua and others, and is a big rubric for thinking about hallucination, trance states, and all these other possibilities that in which knowledge can be produced and which are completely denigrated by the university that imagines objective, rational knowledge. So, but which are used in many of our communities, which are used in other ways and have been denigrated by the university. So I thank you for the 2 points, one about the production of knowledge, and two, about the hallucinatory types of knowledge and perception that produce us. Now, for El Mundo Sordo to think about that, I think for me, one of the most impacting, the most impressive ways that has led to a production of knowledge is not even just the concept, but the fact of its enactment. It is enacted every year and a half in a conference that's organized in Texas by the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua, which was founded by Norma Cantu, who is also a brilliant scholar of Anzaldua's work. And it brings together thousands of feminists and queers to think together about Anzaldua's work. And I have given a small example in my own work, but I multiply that by thousands. You know, many people are inspired by Anzaldua and producing knowledge thanks to what Anzaldua gave us. So thank you for the 3 points that you made. They were really very much to the heart of things.
Bom, eu vou falar com a Paula em francês. Eu sei que o Felipe, que está traduzindo, pode também, espero traduzir. Se tiver alguma dúvida, depois eu posso, né, falar em português as minhas questões. Paula, moi aussi, j'ai noté plein de questions. Les 2 questions dont Susana t'a posées, elles m'ont aussi beaucoup interpellée. J'aimerais aussi juste que tu parles un peu plus, par exemple, d'un exemple que je t'ai déjà entendu parler, de quand il y a ces rencontres d'hommage au jour de la mort de Gloria Anzaldua, que les gens vont dans les cimetières, que tu racontes un peu plus de ça, et aussi ce que j'ai vu dans le colloque de Paris, de Sandra Pacheco, par exemple, et d'autres collègues chicanas, qui, au lieu de présenter un texte, un papier, présentaient des performances, et des performances rituelles avec plein de signifiants indigènes, mexicains, tout cela. Et donc, si tu pouvais en rapporter un peu plus sur ces 2 points dont Susana en a parlé. Mais j'aurais d'autres points à te dire. J'ai plusieurs, peut-être on pourra faire en plus une tournée, mais juste pour te dire, je pense que tu nous as apporté ici 3 questions qui me semblent très importantes dans l'œuvre de Gloria Anzaldua. La première, celle dans le...
Attends, juste 2 secondes. Est-ce que je réponds d'abord à tout ce que...
Oui, d'accord. Réponds d'abord. Je pense que c'est mieux.
Sinon, je vais faire un monologue pendant...
Oui. Vas-y.
Et donc, et puis, je ne sais même pas quelle heure il est. Mais merci beaucoup. Je réponds en français ou je réponds en anglais, Miriam? Qu'est-ce que tu
En anglais, c'est mieux parce que les gens sont en train de t'écouter en anglais.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to respond to the questions in English that Miriam just posed in French. And so to begin with, I'll just mention what she asked about. First, she wanted to know more about the ceremony in front of Anzaldua's gravesite and what that is about. And then she wanted to know about how instead of an academic paper, some people have dealt with Anzaldua's work by performing ritual or doing other forms of performance that are inspired by her work. And that, I would add, though Miriam didn't say this, admittedly, also produce knowledge in the spirit that Susana just mentioned. So first, the grave ceremonies. There is with the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua. I went actually to the gravesite of Anzaldua with the people from the society, the others from the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua. And what happened there was a homage to her. People spoke, prayers were said, she was honored, her family was there, her aunt, one of her aunts and her one of her nieces, they were there. And then we went to her old high school where she used to, where she was a student, and there was a performance there in honor of her. And I mentioned that because it's important that she is actually locally honored. which is not the case for a lot of queers of color. So, or queers, even white queers. So she was locally honored. And the gravesite was an extremely moving experience. However, I also want to mention, because you mentioned Sandra Pacheco, I was on the bus with Sandra Pacheco, who is a curandera, and we were stopped by basically the migra. We were really stopped. We were stopped by the border police on the way there and on the way back. And we are there, sitting there, you know, a bus full of feminists of color going, and I forgot to bring my passport, because one can travel in the US, you know, on a driver's license. And I did not have my passport with me, and you know, I was, like many others, afraid that they would send me to Mexico or put me in a cage. So this is what is being done to people, you know. So what happened is they came in with a dog and they looked around and did this and that. And Norma Cantu, who's extremely diplomatic, told them, you know, oh, you know, we're all university professors. And she started taking some people's IDs who had them. I had my university card, but not my passport, because I didn't imagine I needed it internally, but you do need it in Texas at the border. So when they left, Sandra Pacheco stood up with sage and saged the whole bus so that we didn't, you know, to get the negative air out of the bus. Then we got there, we did this, it was a beautiful ceremony. It was so moving. It was so moving that one could become in a trance state just being there. And I was delighted to have a chance to speak with her aunt, and, you know, and then we went back, and on the way back to San Antonio, we also, we first went to the high school and then back. But on the way to the high school, we got stopped again, a second time. You know, they just stop everyone who's brown. So, so then again, the sage came out, and, you know, we did all that. So for the ceremony, I want to mention that the ceremony created the whole experience of the bus, and the ceremony created a very beautiful community that was not necessarily a community of words. It was a community of meaningful silence in most of the time. We did, of course, speak to each other. We did, of course, you know, there were words at the ceremony, but I think the underlying thing was something felt much more than just spoken. And it was extremely beautiful. And even afterwards, we were able to make jokes about the police, but, you know, with caution, because actually this happens systematically to people, and we happen to have the class privilege and the nationality privilege, you know, of actually being documented. And as someone who was not always documented, I spent 7 years undocumented. You know, for me, it's terrifying to see the police there or anywhere else. So, you know, it was quite an experience. The other thing about the rituals at the conference, yes, in fact, the conferences that we put on, the conferences that the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua puts on, include many different kinds of medium. It's not just an academic conference. There are activists there. It is also, there are artists who come, and there are many artists who have been inspired by Anzaldua. And there has been an art show that I went to, actually, at a cultural center, Chicanx Cultural Center, called Esperanza, Hope, and it is at in San Antonio, and they have done an exhibit on work inspired by Anzaldua at the same time as the conference and as part of the conference. It just was in a different, you had to go, but there were buses to go to see it. So it was an integral part of the conference. So the conferences are already conceptualized in Anzalduan terms as multi-genre, many different genres. And of course, as we know, there are things that can be conveyed in different genres. If we think about how genre has, each genre is kind of a container in both the Bakhtinian sense and the Derridian sense. Each genre is actually a container and has its own possibilities. So what cannot be said in an academic paper can in fact be enacted in a ritual or in some kind of performance. Other things can be conveyed through music. So it also included a musical, a show, basically, a concert, and in honor of Anzaldua. So it's many genres and many ways of respecting, and I would say also loving Gloria Anzaldua. And of course, producing from what Gloria Anzaldua did, not just reproducing her work.
Susana, Mary quer perguntar, senão eu tenho mais perguntas a fazer. Susana, queres fazer mais algumas perguntas?
So, just one, if I may, just a little one. I wish Paola could talk a little bit more about the trans queer of color. I mean, it's and its relation with coloniality or colonialism. I think it's, she mentioned in her paper, it's a whole movement of people of color, transgender and queer of color, who are inspired also by Anzaldua's, trying to challenge this white-centeredness and this historiography, which just don't want to see the whole point, the whole history or the thick history, the transsexuality and transgender of color, or queer of color, lesbian of color, and how this all together are using the decolonial tools to challenge the white-centered LGBTQ plus narrative.
Right. Okay, thank you for that question. I would say that, the relationship with coloniality is being theorized by different queers and trans of color folk in different ways. And I'll just give an example from my own life and work. I teach a course now at Berkeley undergrad. In the fall, I'm teaching Sexuality, Culture, and Colonialism. It's in the LGBT minor, inside the LGBT minor. And I'm also teaching a graduate course called Decolonialism and Sexuality at the graduate level. There's lots of work being done in, by queers of color and by trans folks of color in, it's very heterogeneous, so it's difficult to make a blanket statement about it. However, I will say, please read the work of PJ Di Pietro and read the emerging work of this graduate student, Omi Santos Salas, who is doing absolutely brilliant work, and their work is in conversation with each other. But there are other trans and queer of color scholars who are also using the work of Anzaldua. I would direct people to the edited books that come out of the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua's conferences. There are collections, and in them you can find this work. I would just say also that I think one thing that we all recognize is that colonialism imposed gender norms. It imposed binary, hetero gender norms. And actually, in some cases, and I think you had Ronke, Ronke Oyewumi talk here, in some cases it imposed gender itself, where, colonialism. But colonialism also imposed, in many places, a binary gender, places that had many different genders, places where, and very often in indigenous communities, for example, there are 5, 6 genders or 10 genders, many genders, and the narrowing down, reduction, the colonial imposition, the colonial reduction of genders, and the colonial outlawing of homosexuality, transsexuality, transgender, etc. The colonial outlawing of everything that was not the heteronormative genders and sexuality. It is something that has been dealt with in the work of many people. I think, Maria Lugones wrote an article that's very well known on the coloniality of gender, but in it she does draw on much of this prior scholarship that demonstrates the colonial imposition of gender. And I think that, it's very important to understand the impact of colonialism, of course, is economic. It is, of course, cultural. It is, of course, psychic, relational, pedagogic, everything. And it is also part of the construction of gender and of sexuality in every place that colonialism touched. So, for example, the British outlawed homosexuality in over 50 countries under colonialism. And now they have the nerve, along with the US government and many others, in the age of homo-nationalism, to talk about how, we have human rights for, our queer people. Really, you are the ones who outlawed it everywhere in the world. And now you want to talk about you are the saviors. They are the white saviors of the world. So these kinds of critiques are critiques of colonial power that emerge within many of the works of queer and trans people of color today, and queer and trans in the global South also. So I would also tell you about a network called Decolonizing Sexualities Network. I am one of the 4 coordinators at this time. Hopefully we will have others in the future. But you can find it online. And we just about a few months ago had a long conference that took place over several weekends and was where we heard about colonialism and queer, the impact of colonialism and queer. And PJ Di Pietro also spoke there, among many others. And this work is being done, whether it's in Guatemala or Uganda or, anywhere in Europe, it's being done. And it's very interesting, and I hope that you will link up with this and become, and we'll continue the dialogue.
Paola, dans la séquence de ce que tu réponds à Suzanne, j'aimerais que tu parles un peu plus, par exemple, dans le texte que tu as écrit avec Jules Falquet pour le cahier de CEDREF, vous avez traduit Gloria Anzaldua et d'autres féministes of color des États-Unis. Vous faites une distinction, j'aimerais que tu parles un peu plus sur quelle est la différence que vous voyez entre qu'est-ce que c'est être queer of color, dans le sens que Gloria Anzaldua propose que queer, ce n'est pas une identité, mais une relation de pouvoir dans laquelle, bon, tu viens de parler, il faut prendre en considération colonialité, racisme, misogynie, etc. Et puis un deuxième mouvement, disons, que ce serait ce queer blanc, qui est, que vous proposez, que c'est seulement une version un peu plus radicale que celle du mouvement LGBT, qui en fait veut beaucoup plus une intégration des gays, lesbiennes, trans dans la société, bon, dans toutes les luttes, disons, pour mariage, enfants, etc. J'aimerais que tu en parles un peu plus de ça, et en parlant aussi de comment tu vois dans le travail d'Anzaldua, que serait donc cette théorie féministe blanche et la théorie féministe of color. Qu'est-ce que ça signifie? Tu peux mieux définir cette théorie féministe blanche, puisque tu parles beaucoup de la théorie féministe non blanche, et si tu peux en parler un peu plus de queer, blanc, non blanc, et féministe blanc et non blanc, dans l'œuvre de Gloria Anzaldua.
Ok, bien sûr, oui, je peux le faire. Je vais le faire en anglais, n'est-ce pas? Je le fais en anglais, n'est-ce pas?
Oui.
C'est ça, ok. Okay, first I'd like to translate Miriam's question. It is about the definition of white feminism and white queer theory. It's about the definition also of queer of color, and what does that mean? And she wants more, like she asked me to elaborate that question a bit, that I actually just said a few words about in the text, just a few sentences. So I will elaborate it. First of all, to think about white feminism and white queer theory, which we can think of in terms of, you know, the thinness of genealogies, the thin and also just a thin part of queer that is often made to stand in dominant discourses, made to stand in for all of queer and disappears everyone else. In other words, it disappears queers of color, feminists of color, etc. There is an idea with white feminism and white queer that they invented feminism, they invented queer, and you know, everyone else came later, which of course is in line with the colonial discourse about backward, need to catch up, and all that. So even within queer movements and within feminism, there is a reproduction of colonial tropes about colonized people and people of color being backward and having to catch up. So because white queer is made, and white feminism and white queer theory is imagined to have come first. It's the original, and we just came after. As we know, that is not true. I just spent an hour telling you about Anzaldua's relationship to queer and her innovative work. And I also don't want to act as though Anzaldua is the first, and therefore we now have an original. I think we need to do the historical work of who else may have talked about queer and been, like Anzaldua, erased, made absent. So we still have more work to do, and this is part of the Anzalduan inspiration to produce more knowledge. But to get to the definition, I define white feminism and white queer theory not in essentialist terms, not as a morphology. It's not about white people produce white theory. No, it's not that. It is, I have a political definition of white theory, a political definition that is grounded in a relationship to relations of power. In other words, I consider white theory to be that kind of theory that reproduces colonialism, capitalism, racism, even while it imagines itself to be fighting whatever patriarchy, which to me is also a problematic term because there are many structures of sexism and queer phobia that do not come under the rubric of patriarchy. There is, for example, filiarchy. There is fraternarchy, the rule of the brothers. That's what democracy is supposed to be, by the way. You know, the rule of the brothers. They got rid of the king, the patriarch. So I have called that misogynarchy. It's a big rubric, misogynarchy, which allows us to talk about many different kinds of sexist structures and arrangements. But white, to me, is not an essentialist term, and it is not about a morphology. There are white people who can produce anti-colonial and decolonial theory, and I consider that they are not producing white theory just because they are white. They are producing decolonial theory, even if they are white. An example is someone like the recently deceased Lauren Berlant, who critiqued colonialism in the US and racism and capitalism head on. This is not white theory. Lauren is, you know, a white subject, but she's not producing white theory. So for me, we have to detach the essentialist conception of white from what white becomes. White becomes white supremacist. In other words, it becomes the white, when I'm thinking about white theory, is about the reproduction of white supremacy. And of course, the reproduction of colonialism and of capitalism generally, but these all together, because you can have some white theories that critique capitalism that don't ever deal with coloniality or with race. So that is, for me, the main point about white theory. And, you know, many people like to, dominants in the US like to characterize everything, all the thought of women of color, like to reduce it to essentialist notions of race. You know, we are always imagined to be, oh, they're in identity politics. You know, all they do is identity politics. Well, you know, that's why I need to distinguish between, this is not about identity politics. This is about relations of power, and it is an anti-essentialist definition of white theory. Any theory that reproduces colonialism and racism, and that is a feminist theory or a queer theory, is to me white feminist or white queer theory. That's it. I see that in those terms. And the theories by people of color and by people from the global South that interrogate coloniality, racism, which happens almost invariably because of being directly confronted with subalternity in relation to it, you see. So it happens almost invariably, but there are some people who don't, you know, who wouldn't. I can think, for example, of the way that in India, some Dalit feminists have critiqued upper caste feminists for reproducing caste in feminism. You see, so there are, you know, we need to work with the heterogeneity of each context. And that is how I would think about that, you know, about the white in white queer theory and in white feminist theory. Unfortunately, white theory is that which travels the most. And so it becomes reinforced everywhere. And in some places, it is reinforced unthinkingly by people who are also dominant by feminists who are also in their countries. and not necessarily critiqued. So that's also a problem. We have a transnational whiteness happening, you know, the production of a transnational whiteness.
Thank you very much, Paula. Nosso super querido tradutor, Felipe Fernandes, ele vai ter que se ausentar para um outro compromisso que ele tem na UFBA, e eu não sei se vai ser possível tecnicamente. Susana, se tu vais poder ir para o outro canal da tradução, se nós temos mais perguntas, eu não sei se a professora Mary Castro tem alguma questão a colocar, ou o que fazemos, Susana?
Eu acho que eu não consigo ir para o canal. Eu poderia falar aqui, mas eu acho que eu não consigo ir para o canal porque eu não estou como intérprete. Não sei, Giovana, o que você acha? Tem perguntas do chat do YouTube, eu posso traduzir, não tem problema, mas talvez eu tenha que fazer aqui.
Uhum.
Sim, Susana, vai ter que ser na sala mesmo, porque eu teria que te colocar para dentro da sala de novo como intérprete, e aí talvez a gente perca um tempo nisso. Não temos perguntas nos chats do YouTube, tá mais tranquilo, vocês podem continuar conversando aí, e qualquer coisa a gente avisa vocês.
Bom, talvez então a gente possa fazer uma última rodada de perguntas e encerrar, né? Eu sei que está todo mundo muito cansado também, hoje foram 3 horas na sessão da manhã, ainda temos sessão à noite, talvez a gente possa, né, fazer só mais algumas perguntas. O que tu acha, Susana? Quer se perguntar mais alguma coisa? Senão eu posso fazer uma outra pergunta.
Eu tenho mais uma pergunta, mais uma.
Tá, então vá lá, tu faça uma, eu faço uma, e agora nós vamos fazer o seguinte, né? A partir de agora, agradecemos o Felipe, e nós vamos fazer a pergunta, e a gente vai escutar a Paula e traduzir na sequência, não simultaneamente, né, como o Felipe estava fazendo até agora, né?
As you said, today we heard Oyeronke talk, and at the last moment of the talk, I asked her about Maria Lugones. And I asked her for me, it was a normal question. Why she quotes so much Maldonado Torres, Aníbal Quijano? She's very interested in the whole colonial modernity authors. And I think it's strange how she reacts. And I would like you to, maybe with you, to think about it. Maybe there is some clue. I didn't get it. For me, Maria Lugones played a very important role in using and making reference to her work in the 2008 paper, Gender and Coloniality. Oyeronke has a very important place in her paper, yes, much more than the others, Native Americans. And it's not the way she reacted. She said, okay, Susana, you said that she quote my work, so why do I have to quote her? I mean, it's not a kind of answer I expect, although I respect her work and I love her work and I'm working on her work. But it's the kind of absence of generosity. I don't know why, and maybe you know why. Is there something I don't know about Oyeronke and Lugones? Because we know Lugones is very special in the gender and the coloniality, and although all those maybe many didn't recognize, don't want to recognize, it's also a same kind of erasery that we are talking when we talk about queer white-centered theory. I don't know. Maybe you have a clue.
eu vou traduzir, porque assim, né, como nós estamos aqui num momento de tradução e aprendendo com a Gloria Anzaldua, que tradução é sempre interpretação e sempre tradução cultural, eu vou fazer bem rapidinho a minha tradução da Susana, já, evidentemente, já incorporando também a minha reflexão. A Susana, né, perguntou, se referindo ao debate de hoje de manhã, com a Orienke, onde ela perguntou para ela, bom, por que tu não citas a Maria Lugones, uma vez que a Maria Lugones, né, uma autora decolonial latino-americana muito importante, te cita muito na obra dela. E a Susana disse que ficou desconcertada, e eu também assistindo, né, fiquei assim impactada com a resposta que ela deu, hoje, dizendo assim, mas por que eu teria que citá-la? Né? Que significa isso? E eu acho, e aí agora sou eu, Miriam Grossi, né, que estou acrescentando na pergunta da Susana, depois eu falo para a Paula. Eu acho que nós também, de alguma forma, talvez a nossa reflexão enquanto brasileiras, latino-americanas, na nossa reflexão sobre o que é o decolonial, nós também nos imaginamos numa irmandade dos países do Sul, e nos vemos numa relação, digamos, de reciprocidade, onde, para a gente, a ideia de citação e de referenciar o outro é uma forma de estabelecer laços, de estabelecer vínculos. E talvez isso, né, que tenha chocado, pelo menos a mim, que estava escutando, né, a pergunta da Susana e a resposta, isso que para nós é tão caro, esse conceito, né, pelo menos eu enquanto antropóloga, de reciprocidade, né, de troca no campo intelectual, que é também algo que a gente aprendeu e que a gente incentiva muito, pelo menos eu, na minha prática de professora feminista, que é justamente da importância de nos citarmos, né, citarmos as nossas, né, colegas, as nossas referências aqui, né, do Sul e não só do Norte. Paula, j'ai traduit ce que Susana t'a demandé sur ce qui s'est passé ce matin, et j'ai
compris parce qu'elle m'a parlé en anglais. Elle a parlé en anglais.
Oui, elle t'a parlé, mais moi, j'ai ajouté...
Ton commentaire, je ne l'ai pas vraiment compris, donc tu peux traduire.
Non, donc, parce qu'elle racontait que ce matin, elle avait demandé à Yoronke pourquoi elle ne citait pas Maria Lugones, et elle a dit, bon, pourquoi dois-je la citer dans un sens, étant donné qu'elle est une blanche, et que, bon, moi, je ne suis pas obligée de citer tous les gens qui me citent. Et moi, j'ai ajouté, parce que j'ai été en train d'écouter la question et la réponse ce matin, et je me suis posée aussi dans le sens de qu'une partie importante, je me suis aussi sentie interpellée par cette réponse, dans le sens où nous, brésiliennes d'Amérique du Sud, nous pensons d'une certaine façon, quand nous travaillons en tant que féministes, qui essayons d'être décoloniales, d'établir des ponts, un concept aussi important pour Gloria Anzaldua, entre les Suds. Et en pensant que, bon, que citer une collègue du Sud est une façon d'établir ce pont et d'établir un rapport de réciprocité. Et c'était pour cela qu'on s'est senti un peu choqués. Je pense que Susana te demande de réfléchir un peu sur ça. Si effectivement, nous, là c'est moi qui te demande, dans la suite de la question de Susana, si nous, brésiliennes, est-ce que nous ne sommes pas vues en tant que du Sud, nous peut-être, nous brésiliennes blanches, Maria Lugones, peut-être en tant que blanche, comment elle est vue dans ce mouvement décolonial, comment tu le vois de ton côté. Gente, só para eu vou resumir o que eu falei para a Paula, eu acrescentei eu já tinha feito a minha pergunta aqui, pedindo para ela nos falar um pouco mais, que talvez seja pelo fato de nós, brasileiras, sermos talvez vistas como brancas ou não, nesse contexto, né, dessas relações sul-sul, sul-norte.
So, thank you both for the questions. I think I need to translate into English what
I have to add that one important thing she said, because if I didn't, it will be not honest.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, she said also, the problem with Maria Lugones is that she didn't dig in her own indigenous roots. She haven't roots to dig on. So she pick up me, the African woman, but she should do her ethnography with her own people. She said that. I mean, if you Brazilians want to go to the roots, go to your African roots or indigenous roots, but don't use my work to do your ethnography. That's how I understood. I mean, it's very I don't know.
Thank you for adding that, because I think that's vital. I think that the answer is there. And I want to say two things. One is Oyeronke Oyewumi's work to me is extremely valuable, and I'm really glad that she was featured at this conference. But also Maria Lugones. I have learned quite a bit from Maria Lugones, and she does have a very important place in much of the reflection that many of us are engaged in. Maria Lugones took on Quijano in her article. She also did a kind of deconstruction of and a respectful critique of the prior thin historiography of decoloniality, right? So I really respect the work that she did. And I want to mention that, in the US, there was a conference dedicated to her work. There are many people inspired by her work, including the person I mentioned earlier, PJ Di Pietro. So, but I also want to say that Oyeronke Oyewumi, if the last point that you bring out makes a lot of sense to me, because within the US, where she is based at this time and where I am based at this time, it's an extremely hierarchical society, like all societies. And we live in a settler colony, and all of this continent is a settler colony, including the reservations that are so-called native reservations that are so-called sovereign. They never are completely sovereign, ever. The ones that are even considered the most sovereign, when you go, you realize they are not so sovereign at all. So we are in a settler colony, and all of Turtle Island, all of Abya is a settler colony. So her comment also honestly makes sense.
Sorry, if I have to translate, espera, you stop there, because I'm hearing you and I forgot I have to translate into
I'm
Portuguese.
sorry, I can speak more slowly and break it up if you like.
Yeah, first, yeah. A Paula, ela está dizendo que ela admira o trabalho da Maria Lugones. A Maria Lugones é uma autora importante no estudo decolonial, no estudo feminismo decolonial. Recentemente teve uma conferência nos Estados Unidos em homenagem à obra dela, da qual participou o JP Pietro, que foi um orientando dela, e admira bastante o trabalho da Oyewumi Oyeronke Oyewumi. Ela estava explicando, eu pedi para ela parar, que o fato de eu ter adicionado o que eu adicionei, que a gente acho que esqueceu de traduzir, que é o que a Oyeronke falou. Na verdade, faltou a Lugones um referencial etnográfico ou de base indígena, num sentido de povo local, original, que ela não tinha. Então, ela usou o meu trabalho com a cultura iorubá pré-colonial, usou o trabalho das americanas nativas, mas faltava a ela uma pesquisa de campo própria, que ela poderia encontrar, no caso de vocês, brasileiras, vocês vão encontrar numa raiz aqui, afro-brasileira, mas tem que ter uma base numa cultura própria. E aí ela cita a Oyeron, que ela fala que a Lugones estava trabalhando no México. Na verdade, eu sei que ela estava trabalhando na Bolívia, mas tudo bem, pode ser México também, México, Bolívia, mas enfim, ela estava procurando essas bases próprias. E a Paula começou a responder, eu pedi para ela parar, que ela diz que os Estados Unidos foi uma colônia de povoamento.
Não
né?
não fui, colônia.
É uma colônia de povoamento.
Graças.
Então, ninguém se sente... Ela vive na Ilha da Tartaruga, e mesmo o território, as reservas indígenas, é como se não fosse soberano, não existisse uma relação soberana com a terra. Aí agora, se eu continuo agora.
Obrigada for the translation. Thank you. I want to mention that we need to say is a colony, because to say was is to disappear Native people. So it's important to say is. I also want to mention that situated, if I began my paper by situating myself, it was precisely because I think that we need to know from where we are speaking. And all of us have some levels of subalternity and some levels also of privilege. And I think it's important to name it as we speak. It would avoid. So, for example, if Maria Lugones had mentioned more about Argentina and the massacre of indigenous people, and if she had mentioned that in the article, if she had situated herself, it would have mattered less that she did not deal with, because it's a way of dealing with it. It is a way of situating so that the reader of the text understands from where she is coming. So,
deixa eu traduzir. Let me translate before you continue.
Yeah, just around situated.
Okay, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I went on again. It's my fault.
No, because I don't have this elephant memory.
I know. Well, no, I should have stopped earlier. So thank you for the reminder. Please stop me anytime.
A Paula falou da importância de situar o pensamento, como ela fez no artigo dela. Ela iniciou o texto dela se situando biograficamente as suas origens, as suas referências, né, da onde ela parte na sua fala, da onde ela fala, né? E ela diz, cada um de nós, de alguma forma ou de outra, a gente tem níveis de subalternidade e níveis de privilégio. Isso varia, não é algo, ninguém é 100% subalternizado, ninguém é 100% privilegiado. E essas relações, elas são importantes para você se referenciar. No caso da Maria Lugones, ela não fez no paper dela, não fez essa abordagem situada, no sentido de, talvez se ela tivesse falado dos massacres dos índios na Argentina, né? Ela talvez isso não fosse tão importasse menos o trabalho dela.
Obrigada. I want to mention, that I have learned immensely from Maria Lugones, and personally feel it's important to remember from each author what we learn from them. And I'm less interested in a critique of authors than of what I learned from them. I'm also interested in keeping open. This is my cat screaming in the background. Can you hear her? I hope she's not disturbing you like she is me. So, I'm sorry. So I think that it's productive to critique ideas, such as what Oyeronke Oyewumi did in critiquing the fact of not situating oneself and not talking about from where one is speaking. But it seems it also seems productive to deal with the person's other ideas, which is personally I have learned quite a bit from Maria Lugones, even as I recognize that the critique of the non-situating, of the critique of the gesture of not situating oneself is a valid critique, the one that Oyeronke Oyewumi mentioned, because it is important. We can't know where someone is coming from, and I think that it's very important. Even I told you in the paper, Jeanne Favre-Sada, who wrote.
Wait a moment, break, please. It's just. Ela está falando da importância do trabalho da Lugones, o quanto ela aprendeu com o trabalho da Lugones, e com relação à colocação da Oyeronke, ela falou que é importante fazer críticas às ideias, né? E no caso, o fato da Lugones não ter falado desde um lugar situado, isso talvez tenha sido um problema, mas eu entendi que a Paula disse que o fato a crítica não... Enfim, eu não sei se ela aceitou a crítica, agora eu fiquei em dúvida.
Eu acho que a Paula, eu entendi, não sei, né? Porque agora nós estamos na interpretação, né, da fala da outra. O que eu entendi que a Paula, ela se colocou numa posição mais propositiva e menos, digamos, no sentido de, ao invés de criticar o que não tem, vamos pegar de cada autora o que tem de positivo que nos contribui, e que ela acha que é um pouco, sei lá, um pouco árido, assim, que não leva a muito lugar, ficar só na crítica e num debate, né, das coisas que ela acha que é mais produtivo, pegar, não, essa autora tem tal coisa de positivo e que a gente pode, né, avançar. É isso um pouco que eu entendi da ideia dela, né? Não sei se é isso que ela disse, mas nós estamos aqui em interpretação. Carol, fala
foi
também.
Isso, mas é isso. Foi isso.
So we can read anyone critically. No one is perfect. What I have just presented is also imperfect. And in a couple of years, I may read it and be horrified. So that's why I also feel I never cite directly people I am critiquing, but rather the ideas. But you did ask a particular question to Oyeronke Oyewumi, so she was compelled, to answer it in that way. But in writing, for example, she might have done it differently. I have been asked many times, okay, who are the white feminists? Who are the white queers? And so, this is the criteria. Go read them and ask yourself that question. I'm not here to denounce people, Some people who would be denounced 5 years from now, they'll be doing decolonial theory, So I don't want to, so it's unproductive, especially in feminist and queer of color and global Southern contexts, especially, to turn the debates into personal vendetta instead of, can we discuss an idea? Can we decide whether it's important or not, to think about white queer theory, for example, or without naming who are they? Is it important to think about white feminist theory without naming who are they? Is it important to think about situating without saying who is not doing it? Because once we accept an idea, we are not idiots. Everyone can read their own, people can read and decide, or be exposed in other ways from reading and decide. What do you think? So I don't think it's productive to do the name thing.
Was my fault.
No, it's not. I mean, it's an honest question.
It was interesting,
I'm sure it was just spontaneous.
To see her. Wow. Well, o que a Paula disse recapitulando, né, é que todo texto como é que a gente falível, né? Nenhum texto, nenhuma teoria vai ser perfeita e é aberta a críticas. Hoje o texto dela está pronto, daqui a alguns anos, quando ela for ler, ela pode achar que está horrível, que faltou coisas. Então, sempre um texto está sujeito a falhas, né? Por isso, ela prefere, quando for fazer uma crítica, não citar a pessoa, mas sim a ideia. E em termos da ideia, você não fica numa... Aí ela falou mais coisas que eu agora esqueci. Miriam lembra.
Uma coisa que ela falou também... Carol,
a Carol lembra.
Fala, Carol.
Não, eu quero fazer um comentário em cima. Pode fazer a sua leitura, Miriam, do que ela falou, e depois eu acrescento.
Não, é só acrescentar que ela disse isso, de que o importante é se situar, né? A questão do contexto, e de que nós somos pessoas inteligentes, nós somos capazes de ler e nos posicionar, e que o importante é isso, a gente se situar de que lugar que eu estou lendo, em que momento e tal, porque também isso aí, agora eu estou acrescentando nesse debate coletivo aqui que a gente está fazendo, a gente mesmo, a cada vez, sei lá, que eu por exemplo, relendo os textos da Gloria Anzaldua para hoje, para esse encontro de hoje, né, que também os meus alunos estão assistindo e estão fazendo um longo debate no chat interno da aula, que depois eu vou passar para a Paula. Bom, eu também revi coisas que eu não lembrava que eu já tinha lido, e olha que eu já li esse texto, já dei muitas e muitas aulas. Então, eu acho que é isso também, esse situar, é situar a cada momento também da nossa trajetória daquilo que a gente está se colocando naquele momento a partir de outras questões que estão acontecendo. Depois eu traduzo para ela, Carol, fala tu, e depois eu traduzo para ela. Paula, après je te traduis, Carol pode intervenir aussi, parce qu'on est dans un débat sur ce que tu es en train de parler, d'accord?
Okay. Então, eu vou fazer em português, porque daí você traduz junto, né, para não ficar de novo depois traduzindo, pode ser? Bom, eu queria só acrescentar que nós também estamos situadas, né, como latino-americanas. Isso é muito importante, né? Lugones fala de um lugar situado. E daí a gente volta, nem lembro mais qual conversa, né? Que muitas vezes, e foi um ponto que a Susana trouxe também, nós, enquanto pensadoras, né, me coloco, claro, como alguém que ainda tem muito o que aprender e muito o que amadurecer e muito, né, enfim, conhecer, né, com todas as outras perspectivas, né? Mas nós estamos situadas também na América Latina, no Brasil, e nós somos também, e nós passamos pela colonialidade, pela modernidade, colonialidade. Nós temos consciência disso. Então, assim, isso às vezes é deixado de lado, né? Como se nós ainda num lugar de subalternização, né? Como se nós não pudéssemos também falar, né? A partir do nosso lugar. Então, isso é muito importante. E a Lugones, como ela é uma filósofa, né? Eu lembro de uma palestra com o Viveiros, que eu peguei e falei, né, o quanto ali ele estava fazendo filosofia, ele falou, não, eu pergunto para os outros, eu sou antropólogo, né? E essa é a diferença. Nós, filósofos ou filósofas, né, temos talvez uma arrogância, não sei se a arrogância é a melhor palavra, mas nós procuramos, né, fazer especulações ou propor questões a partir do nosso lugar, e ele já é situado como ponto de partida, né, a partir de nós. Claro que não nos conhecem, e nós precisamos sempre, que acho que é o que a Paola trouxe, sempre falar, muitas de nós viemos de classes populares, como a Mônica ontem falou, o pai era, né, da classe trabalhadora, enfim, o fato de ser branco, né, da pigmentação, não retira, né, muitas outras questões que estão envolvidas, e também sofremos a colonialidade, né, não é uma exclusividade, né, enfim, na verdade todas e todos nós dentro da América Latina vivemos isso, né? Então era isso que eu queria, enfim, acrescentar. Eu na verdade queria até falar com a Paola dos desenhos, né, da Glória, que eu tive contato, né, e que eu apresentei no vídeo, enfim, né, que são maravilhosos, se ela puder falar um pouquinho, né, porque eu achei incrível, né, conhecer os desenhos dela.
Bon, je te traduis de la fin vers le début, mais le début, je pense que j'ai déjà un peu perdu. De la fin, elle te demande qu'elle aimerait aussi que tu parles un peu plus sur les dessins de Gloria Anzaldua, qui était, je pense, aussi dans le début avec quand on lisait la lettre et tout. Elle a aussi fait un travail sur ça. Tu disais que tu as vu aussi l'exposition de ces dessins, si tu pouvais en parler. Et puis après, il y a eu toute une discussion ici. Carole, en tant que philosophe, se replaçant aussi que, bon, de se situer, il y a aussi peut-être de la part des philosophes une position d'arrogance, de se croire souvent et parfois mieux que les autres ou avec la meilleure vérité, et que dans le sens des travaux décoloniaux, que nous, en tant que brésiliennes, latino-américaines, etc., on reconnaît aussi, on a aussi une conscience des places de subalternisation qu'on a dans les rapports globaux aussi universitaires, académiques. On est aussi toujours en dessous, même si on parle bien français ou si on parle bien en anglais. Là j'ajoute, là c'est Grossi, c'est pas Carole. On sera toujours moins. On aura toujours. La langue est importante. On apprend ça avec Anzaldua, mais la langue n'est pas suffisante pour ces rapports de domination qui sont au-delà de la langue, sont justement dans ce que ton corps et ta territorialité représentent pour toi-même. Je disais aussi, Paola, que tandis qu'on faisait le débat ici, comme j'ai demandé à mes étudiants undergraduates qui sont là en train de faire de l'anthropologie politique ce semestre, d'écouter ta conférence, et ils ont fait, j'ai vu là, un long débat sur le chat du cours, qu'après je vais t'envoyer tout ce qu'ils ont discuté de ton travail passionnément. Il y a eu un grand débat dans le cours de ce qu'on discutait ici, et je vais te passer aussi plus tard.
May I add to what what Caroline said? I think it's important to repeat. I know Miriam said very well, but I want to explain a little bit because I think she's touching something which concerns we all. We are Latin American, and that is a fact. What this means, and if we hear what Rita Segato said at the first day, she's telling us we are all subaltern. In spite of the fact of our skin color, we are all subaltern. We are all women of color on the point of view of the westernized world. That's a fact. We cannot deny this. And that's why I'm not so comfortable with the answer of Oyeronke. Why? Maria Lugones made a very important political action with her paper.
Absolutely.
She used Oyerome's work, but she made an act, a political action. Because she told our God, Aníbal Quijano, that he made a mistake, not considering gender of oppression. My goodness, can Oyeronke not recognize that she was the person who brought her work inside Latin American as a theory, decolonial theory against colonial power? I cannot understand. Why is that the problem? I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that elaboration. And I totally agree that the work of Maria Lugones is absolutely fundamental and amazing insofar as not only the critique of Quijano and and company, but just what she posits and brings together from multiple sites to argue about the coloniality of gender is extremely useful, and I teach her every semester. So, I think that her work is of vital importance. I want to address the two problems that were posed here and that are both incredibly interesting, and I'm so happy that we're having this discussion. The question of situating and the question of of how it can come off as arrogance, and also that Carol posed, I think, is very important, and that you, Susana, elaborate is very important. That the fact of being from Abya Yala, being Latin American, is always already a position of subalternity in a planetary context. That is true. There is no denying it. It is a position of subalternity. I agree with Rita Segato's beginning statement, for sure. However, I want us to think about subalternity in complex ways. So there are, I'm sorry to keep on putting in my concepts, but this is how I think, but I have this notion of subaltern to dominant continuum. Subaltern to dominant continuum. And what I mean by that, it was through a rereading of Gramsci, and how Gramsci in subaltern studies became, and also outside of subaltern studies, is very often thought to have a notion, this is the subaltern, this is not the subaltern. This is the subaltern, this is the dominant, okay? But there are multiple subalternities if we historicize and contextualize Gramsci. Gramsci was, born in a village in Sardinia, which is already a subaltern part of Italy, and the village, a rural site, is subaltern in relation even within Sardinia. Then he moved to a city and was disconcerted as an adult, then to study, as a student. Then he moved to Turin, which is on the continent and which is the dominant site of Italy. So anyway, without going into a big elaboration, I want to say that there are multiple subalternities. In the settler colony that is the United States, there are multiple subalternities. The subalternity of indigenous people is not the same as the subalternity of Black people, or of Chicanx people, or of Asian people. And all of these have multiple subalternities within them by class, gender, sexuality, many differences, by rural versus urban. So the idea of subalternity is something that we already have to deeply historicize, contextualize, and think of in more complex ways than here's a subaltern and here's not. Definitely for any person from Latin America, if you are on a global stage, it is definitely a positionality of subalternity. I agree completely. However, within Abya Yala, there are multiple subalternities. The subalternity of Maria Lugones is not the same as the indigenous people in Argentina. It is not the same as Black people in Argentina. It's not a big mass. So similarly, when I talked about my situatedness, I can talk about subalternity in many ways. However, I'm also...
Sorry, do I have to translate it? I don't know.
I'm sorry. I keep forgetting. Please stop me. I can go on.
My
forever.
memory, my hardware is not so.
Oh, no, it's not you. I'm at fault completely. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry.
A Paula está falando que ela pedindo licença para falar de um conceito que ela usa, que é dela, que é o conceito de uma continuidade entre subalternidade e dominância. E aí ela falou um pouco do Gramsci, que é o autor de referência para os estudos da subalternidade, que o Gramsci vem de uma cidade bem pequena na Sardenha, foi para a cidade grande e viveu várias trocas de subalternidade em função dessas mudanças pessoais. E dentro dos Estados Unidos, que é hoje uma colônia de povoamento, ela enfatiza isso, não é um país, é uma colônia de povoamento, dentro tem subalternidades também diferenciadas. Você vai ter a subalternidade do nativo, você vai ter subalternidade do negro americano e do latino, enfim. São subalternidades com especificidade. Ela concorda que a América Latina, dentro da geopolítica, ela é subalterna, na geopolítica do conhecimento, usando esse vocabulário que é usado, mas que há subalternidades internas também, que são específicas. A Lugones não tem, na Argentina, a mesma marca de subalternidade que tem o indígena argentino, o Mapuche. Apesar dela, entre aspas, se considerar a cabecita negra. Isso é o que estou acrescentando, né? Ela se considera negra, mas é um detalhe. Pronto, desculpa.
Okay.
You can continue.
I forgot where I was going with it, but I just wanted to say that we need to think about the context. So, for example, well, we need to think more with contexts. And I would say that definitely within a planetary context, I fully agree with Rita Segato's statement about we are all subaltern. I would also say that if that is in a planetary dominant context, which the academy almost invariably is, you know, the conferences and all that. But if it is in, we need to look more closely at what's going on also in how everyone is situated. For example, I do see myself as I'm partially in subalternity. I'm also partially in dominance for class because of my acquired class, you know, and because it is the US is empire. I mean, you know, basically the US is empire. But what does one do with it is, to me, the most important. Okay, so I am a subaltern subject in relation to that empire, but because I am in the empire, I also become, you know, a subject of empire. So you know, it's contradictory, it's complex. And
please.
Okay.
Senão não consigo.
Thank you for stopping.
Sim, realmente ela está enfatizando que é importante o contexto, né? O contexto nesse sentido da referência da subalternidade. É claro que no contexto geopolítico, no contexto da geopolítica, todos os latino-americanos são subalternos. Nesse contexto. Agora, no contexto de onde ela fala que é os Estados Unidos, ela pode ser subalterna com relação ao império, ao Estado imperialista, mas ela adquiriu um privilégio a partir do momento que ela fala desde uma posição privilegiada de representante dessa academia e desse império, porque ela fala desde uma universidade, desde uma instituição norte-americana, e, portanto, ela tem uma posição de dominação nessa relação dentro desse outro contexto.
Thank you. Another point is, if we get back to who began to theorize subalternity, first of all, subaltern, which is Gramsci, and then subalternity, the subaltern studies group, we can get more into this discussion. So, for example, with Gramsci is an Italian, he's white, but he is talking about subalternity of white peasants, of white, of Italian peasants, of Italian workers. For Gramsci, the subaltern is many positionalities. And I think that's very useful. It's the positionality of workers, positionality of peasants, positionality of what in Italy is called the Mezzogiorno, meaning the south, from Rome downwards, plus Sardinia and the other islands. Geographically, there's a geographical definition to the subaltern because it is a geographical cultural definition. And it is a definition of non-industrialization, of rurality in the time that Gramsci was writing. And so for Gramsci, there are many subalterns, not just one, many. And that's important.
Okay.
And he
just a break and then you continue.
Okay.
A Paola está dizendo que tem uma diferença entre subalterno e subalternidade. Subalterno é o conceito do Gramsci, e ele é um italiano branco que pensa o subalterno a partir de muitas posições que são posições que podem ser posições do camponês, do trabalhador, posição de todos os que pertencem geograficamente ao sul da Itália, que é considerado não desenvolvido, não industrializado. Então, é uma definição de posicionalidade que tem a ver também com cultura e geografia.
And yes, and of course, the class relations, no matter where they are, and the relations and peasants, rurality, even in the north of Italy, which is geographically and culturally dominant compared to the south. Actually, today in Italy, the fascists say that everything, the Mezzogiorno downwards, is Africa and not Italy. That's what the fascists are saying in Italy right now. So the part that Gramsci designated geographically as subaltern is associated with, by the fascists, with Africa. And it's not just
Deixa eu acrescentar, just a minute, just a second, porque ela acrescentou, eu falei, posicionalidade de espaço geográfico e cultural, mas também de classe. É importante ter isso claro. Hoje, quer dizer, no caso do Gramsci, quando você pode falar do norte, lá no norte da Itália tem também trabalhadores, camponeses, a questão de classe é muito importante. Uhum. E hoje os fascistas que ocupam o norte se referem ao sul como sendo a África um lugar subdesenvolvido.
Yes. So then we have the notion of subalternity. That notion comes with subaltern studies and subaltern studies from India, which was in India very long before it was brought to the United States, and then from empire became more known as a concept. When it was locally known in India, just in India, it was not considered it was not considered. So here we get into what you were saying, Susana, earlier about what comes from the South is always subaltern, you know. So there was that subalternity of subaltern studies globally, but then it went to the US.
Let me translate it. Agora ela passou para o conceito de subalternidade, que é um conceito que tem a origem na Índia, nos estudos subalternos, e é um conceito que já era bastante usado por bastante tempo, mas ele só se popularizou mundialmente quando ele foi transposto para o Império, os Estados Unidos. E, a partir daí, se espalhou como conceito importante.
Thank you. Then we have also what many people don't yet know is that in India there is a critique of subaltern studies because it is a critique by Dalits of the fact that subaltern studies was thought through by upper caste people, by, you know, Ranajit Guha, and it is a critique of how the upper caste gets to think about peasants or other categories that they are not a part of, and they have silenced the voices of the people from the communities making critiques. For example, Dalits have had their own publishing company for about almost 100 years. Well, at least 50 years, maybe more. It's called the Dalit Sahitya Academy. There's one in Bangalore. And, you know, they have published their analyses for decades and decades and decades, completely unknown and never cited in subaltern studies. So, you know, there's a critique of subaltern from that positionality, which is why I'm making the point about multiple subalternaities. Subaltern studies...
Just a second, because there is some points that I'm not sure.
Okay.
You talk about the critique. No. Na tradução, a crítica aos estudos subalternos que foi feita dentro da própria Índia, entre intelectuais da Índia. Pelo que eu entendi, a Miriam vai me ajudar, a crítica se dá ao fato dos autores dos estudos subalternos serem autores da upper class, da classe alta.
And caste.
Da casta, da casta.
Casta, because the critique is coming from Dalit. Dalit is like untouchable.
Eu não conheço.
Ela está dizendo isso, quer dizer, que atualmente na Índia, a grande, digamos, assim como no Brasil, nós temos todas as políticas de ações afirmativas para negros, indígenas. Na Índia, um movimento similar é justamente das castas subalternas, e a principal casta subalterna são os Dalits, né, que é a tradução de lentilha, né, que são aqueles, né, os de baixo. E são os Dalits hoje que estão na frente do movimento nas universidades, na política. São movimentos muito... que eu estou, né, traduzindo que ela está falando sobre os Dalits, que são muito fortes, e são eles que estão criticando, dizendo, bom, mas esses autores indianos que criaram a teoria subalterna, estudos subalternos, na verdade, como Gayatri Spivak, por exemplo, são autores das castas altas, né? E, portanto, também no interior da Índia há essa crítica também ao que, teoricamente, os estudos subalternos seriam esses estudos que estariam, né, falando dos subalternos, mas na Índia, esses são os indianos subalternos, desses de castas altas, em relação ao resto do mundo. Mas na Índia, os verdadeiros subalternos indianos, que são os Dalits, reclamam hoje e lutam, né, dizendo isso. Esses estudos subalternos não nos representam, porque quem os faz são essas pessoas de altas castas.
Aí ela fala, é só para
Paula, sur Dalit et un peu sur la situation de l'Inde pour que les gens comprennent au Brésil, d'accord?
Foi ótimo.
Tu viens de l'expliquer ou tu veux que je l'explique?
Non, non, j'ai déjà expliqué.
Ok, très bien.
D'accord, parce que je sais aussi ce que tu penses.
Oui, merci. C'est gentil, vraiment, c'est super, merci. Ça nous
Mas ela falou também da editora, né? Que eles têm uma editora durante muito tempo e os livros não conseguem ser lidos, é isso? É isso?
So with that, I wanted just to say that there are multiple subalternities and even multiple dominants, and that it's difficult to find a pure subject. I am not a pure subject. It's difficult to find a pure subject. I don't know any pure subject. We can say there's always someone more subaltern than thou. If you think you're the most subaltern, there's always someone more subaltern. So, and it's also situational. It's a relation of power. To define subaltern, it's a relation of power.
Eu vou traduzir para a gente ser, né, para ser mais rápido, assim, para ser mais curto cada tradução, ajudar a Susana, que eu sei que uma hora cansa. Só para dizer isso, quer dizer que ela está dizendo que tem muitas subalternidades e muitas dominações, muitos dominantes, que todo sujeito ele é permanentemente subalterno e dominante, e que sempre, mesmo que tu seja o mais subalterno possível, tem outro mais subalterno que tu, né, do teu lugar. Então, que pensar nisso, na subalternidade, não é uma posição fixa, é uma posição permanente de relações relações onde tem subalternos e dominantes.
There are degrees of subalternity, not absolute subalternity, not absolute dominance, degrees of subalternity. And I believe that the subalternity invoked by Rita Segato is totally true. I totally agree that in a planetary context, any voice coming out of Latin America is subaltern in relation to dominant voices. That is true. It is not by chance that we hear about, Foucault, Derrida, and, people from France. We don't hear about people coming from other parts of the world unless their work is available in empire. That is true. And so we need to recognize and work with that.
Ela concorda, né, com o que diz a Rita Segato, que justamente dizer que na situação mundial hoje, todas as vozes vindo da América Latina vão ser subalternas, né, e que não se escuta no mundo, nem nos países do norte, nem em todo o mundo, vozes de outros lugares, que isso é um dado real, concreto, né, desse momento que estamos vivendo. Paula, je te passe la parole et je pense qu'on peut peut-être finir ici sur cette dernière, si tu as encore quelque chose à dire.
About subalternity and subaltern, not really, just that I find it useful to think with the complexities of the contextual relations of power. That because then we avoid, it's more accurate, first, and secondly, we avoid, precisely the kind of arrogance that Carol was talking about. That Carol raised a question of, arrogance. Well, if we think of fixed subalternity, when we live on a planet, we live in, let's look at scale. We live in a very small scale, one's community, then a city, a nation, a planet, a region, and a planet. So, there can be relations of power among all of these. Among all of these, there are relations of power within a community, in between the community and the state, between, if you are from an indigenous community in the US, you have a specific relationship to the US state, that where you have no say in anything. I mean, they are, unless there's a social movement that changes that, but it's set up, the relations of power are set up in a particular way. If you, depending on where you are, in India, for example, many people think of India as a big blob, but when they don't know India, but India has colonies, many kinds, and a major one is Kashmir. It's colonized by India. It's a military occupation, the thickest occupation in the world. There are more military personnel from India in Kashmir, which is asking for independence, which is demanding independence, than there are anywhere else in the world. So what do you do with the subalternity of the category South Asia? You see, so it's complex, is what I'm saying.
Can I just say something? Just to clarify, I agree totally with you, and thank you very much for this explanation, because I think it's very important. We study from Spivak about subalternity, and I think it's very important. But the main part of I was talking, it's about coloniality, about the system of the project of coloniality and modernity, that we are in South Brazil, or from the Sul Global, we are subordinated, or we have this in the same way. And I think when I said Lugones is situated, and as me, as Susana, as every woman, white woman too, in South America, but we are situated in a coloniality. Of course, there are many kinds, and we can't ignore this. That's very important when we know this. But we are all, we suffer, or are many oppressions, and we know that. Of course, if we are in some place, we have to situate our place, when you said. I don't like to extend more, because the Giovanna and the others have to take a break.
Okay.
But thank you very much for your explanation.
Bom, então deixamos a tradução para mais tarde, né, Susana? Então encerramos. Eu acho que tu pode encerrar, depois eu pode traduzir por escrito no texto que vai ficar, né, online.
O texto vai para o livro. Já está traduzido. Was wonderful. Was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Paula. The opportunity to hear you, and also all the explanations, and it's very helpful. And I just had a wonderful afternoon. I thank you all for staying with us until now. And see you later. We have not the conclusion of the journey.
Thank you so much, Susana and Carol and Miriam, everyone who who worked to bring everyone together today, and for the entire conference. I think it's amazing, and it's very exciting that these debates are taking place, and that and I'm very honored to have been invited. I thank you for that very much. Thank you.
And I'm going to ask Miriam your contact, because I want to take part of this Gloria Anzaldua network.
Okay.
And if it's possible, I don't know if I have to show my credentials.
You don't have to show any credentials. It's very open. And you can even look at it online, because the Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldua has a website. And but I would love to also be in touch with you for that, and also to continue these discussions, which I think are important. And also I learn a lot from you and from the questions. Even though I'm supposed to be the speaker, I want to thank you for what I learned here today.
Obrigada a todos. Obrigada, graças.
Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Namaste.
Recording stopped.
Obrigada a todo o público que também nos assistiu e nos acompanhou até agora. E daqui a pouco a gente tem mais. Obrigada, Miriam.
Obrigada a todos, todas y todos, porque hay Felipe también. Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.